Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and behind me is the house of Samuel Pepys. It's obviously been extensively renovated since it was built in the early 17th century. So we're on Buckingham Street in London. Well, Samuel Pepys is perhaps the world's most famous diarist, and been born in 1633 in Fleet Street, which is just up the hill. That's the rear of Fleet Street, those buildings you can see. So the Thames came right to the bottom of the street here. You see that? That was York Gate. That was a water gate, as in boats would come to there. Only in the 1860s was the embankment built, and that made the river to keep to its own appointed limits. The Thames about twice as wide as it is now. That was called the York Gate because the Archbishop of York had his archiepiscopal palace in London here. Didn't spend all his time in York. Anyway, so Pepys was born into an upper middle class family. He had a number of prominent relatives, members of Parliament, and he was brought up by a nursemaid just outside London in Kingsland in the county of Middlesex. Is now considered part of London. And then he went to school in Huntingdon briefly, and latterly he was here and he went to St Paul's School, which was right beside St Paul's Cathedral in those days. Now it's much further west. It's moved twice since his time. So he was at one of the realm's most prominent places of education, and he was a very clever boy, not so sporty. He was musically gifted. He played several instruments. I don't think he sang though. So he was one of 11 children, but at least 4 of his siblings died in childhood because infant mortality was very high, even for a fairly well-off family like his, because the city was filthy, there was rubbish everywhere, there were open sewers, there were rats scurrying around, and so on. There were fires. We knew very little about medicine. Some people were malnourished, people didn't have adequate clothing or heating in winter, and so on. Anyway, he then went to Cambridge University. He enrolled at Magdalen College. He was awarded a couple of exhibitions and eventually a sizarship, which is a sort of scholarship. So he was quite well off as an undergraduate, not having to pay any fees, given his bed and board for free. And one of the people he impressed was Sir George Downing, who was later Chancellor of the Exchequer and grandfather of the founder of Downing College, Cambridge. So he spent 4 years at Cambridge. He graduated, he returned to London, and he worked in various governmental posts. In those days, it was all about who you knew, not what you knew. He was well connected, so he was a functionary for most of the rest of his life. He was a civil servant in several departments. Most famously, he was clerk to the Board of the Admiralty, so as in charge of the Royal Navy. He wasn't in charge of it, but he was a fairly high-up administrator in all that. So he was well off. When he was 23, he married a 14-year-old. Wouldn't have been controversial back then. I know it would be illegal now. Had a few children with her. And indeed, I've met one of his descendants who says the surname is pronounced Pepys, not Pepys. But I mean, everyone apart from that pronounced it Pepys. If I said Pepys to you, you wouldn't know who I was talking about. Anyway, so he had a ringside seat for all these crucial events of the 17th century. Indeed, he went to witness the execution of Charles I, and said that such a groan was let out when the head was smitten from the body. He wished never to hear such a sound repeated in his life. Anyway, so despite being married and being a zealous Christian, he had a number of extramarital affairs. Apart from actual intercourse, he was often lascivious, groping his maid and so on. So he kept a diary from 1660 for about 10 years, which he wrote a sort of code in a melange of languages: English, Latin, French and Italian, and various abbreviations, so the idea people wouldn't understand it. But then again, he did write a book which is sort of like a skeleton key to this, so you could decipher what he was writing. But most people thought that he didn't want anyone else to read it. But why did he keep this code then? Was it so he could read it himself in case he forgot later on exactly what the code was? So it's an incredibly detailed account of his life. There are also some particulars there about what he consumed each day, how much money he had. He had suffered from status anxiety. He was also trying to evaluate his position in the hierarchy, about his ailments. He was plagued by bladder problems and so on, which seemed to run in the family. And he was here when the plague broke out. Some people think he must have had some sort of natural immunity to it, wasn't stricken by it. And he pointed out how the religious died just as much as the irreligious. So it didn't seem to be like God was saving the righteous and smiting the ungodly. And then about the Great Fire of London, he recounted that in immense detail as well. So he lived on till 1703. He'd been a member of Parliament briefly. And so nobody could read his diary until 1819. Someone cracked the code and began translating it into plain English. Although the chap who was doing it didn't realise that Pepys had a code book to it, which was subsequently discovered. So he was an incurable bibliophile, bibliomane indeed, and owned thousands of volumes. So they were donated to Magdalen College, Cambridge, his old college, when he died. There's a Pepys Library named there in his honour. So he's an absolutely fascinating figure, and what he wrote is a scintillating source for anybody who wants to know what was really going on in the 17th century, because he wrote it with extraordinary candour. Well, that and Pepys is there's another place down there, number 14, where he lived briefly, but that's not the original building, whereas this is. That is just a little bit about Samuel Pepys. Toodaloo.